This is Mae Brussell. It's broadcast number 668, September the 28th, 1984. Last week I didn't have time on the broadcast, on the tape, to list the subjects that we shared just a year ago at this time, but they're terribly important, as are all the broadcasts of the linkage of news coming out now and the material I'm covering this year and the groundwork I set last year. That was September 19th and September 26th, broadcast number 615 and 616. Those broadcasts were primarily on the Korean airline, the proof that it was a provocateur operation, the links of Larry McDonald to Western Goals organization that I went into in depth through this whole time period. People on the board of Western Goals are also associated with Ronald Reagan and Jerry Falwell and the far right, and the desire to turn this country into a Christian nation. So I want to proceed with what's going on today, but last year, if you took those broadcasts or have them, there is a lot of material there that is groundwork for what we will be discussing now. The Korean airline was the big story, and also I had quotations from various articles and news stories on the mystery of Flight 007, why it was doomed, and the pilot boasting that they did CIA missions such as this. And exactly 1 year later, our president is not talking about evil empire. He is meeting with Mr. GROMYKO, and there's been a change in Ronald Reagan's tone in what he's saying as of just 2 weeks ago. And of course, GROMYKO comes armed with the evidence 1 year later, and they had it all along, of the purposeful downing of that plane. And that, again, going into bullets and blackmail, makes Reagan and the United States always, of course, weak because we're caught with our lies. But for whatever reason, they finally are getting together. There are a lot of articles about this meeting that will have taken place by the time you get this tape. One, Why Dinner with Andre? Of course, that was my favorite movie 1 or 2 years ago, My Dinner with Andre. And this time it's Andre GROMYKO. The L.A. Herald has Why Dinner with Andre. Time Magazine, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? The L.A. Times, The Russian is coming, but why? The New York Times, the United States is holding up their study of accusing the Soviet on arms agreements, breaking the agreements. I mentioned that last week. Wall Street Journal, Andre in the Rose Garden, Joseph Kraft bagging GROMYKO, and it goes on and on. I'd love to share the details of these, but again, there isn't time. Maybe later, or maybe I'll do an article just on this subject. And of course, if you saw the news today, and you will have seen it, it'll be a week old by the time you get this, and Mr. Reagan will have met with Andre GROMYKO. He's smiling and holding his hand. They measured it. It was 23 seconds that their first encounter lasted, and Ronald Reagan was warm and friendly with a lot of laughter, according to Larry Speaks. You know how ha-ha that must have been. But now they're very genial, and they're open to frank discussions, and Ronald Reagan goes before the United Nations. You heard him, and quotes Mahatma Gandhi. Always he's quoting the Democrats, whether it's Roosevelt or Truman or John Kennedy, even Lyndon Johnson. I mentioned that on one of the broadcasts I do where I put the records on Monday nights here. They can't quote Harding or Coolidge or Herbert Hoover, but here he had the nerve. It's okay. If he tones things down, he was beaming and quoting Mahatma Gandhi. There was a long article in the L.A. Herald, Sunday Herald, yesterday on Reagan boning up on books of Russia. He hadn't read any on the Soviet Union, so quickly they brought him 5 books, and they handed him one, The Land of the Firebird. They should have given him Michael Sayers' book and Albert Kahn's The Great Conspiracy, but that has to do with the Hoover Institute and Herbert Hoover, and I don't think he's going to change his mind much, but he's changing his face, and they've noted in the New York Times and other papers that he didn't talk about the evil empire, and they asked him whether reading the books would change his mind, that the Soviets were doomed for the ash heap of history. But Ronald Reagan smiles. No, if they're meeting, that's fine. I'm not complaining. But the terms upon which they met, I think, were very interesting. And if you studied it day to day, he's on a position of actual weakness, I believe, but he always was. And the analysis of the various news people is mostly nauseating. I try not to read editorials, and I have to hear some of their explanations. but they haven't hit the shots yet on why Reagan is so anxious. It isn't just because it's an election year. It was now or never, and he chose now. Thank goodness. The Friday London Times has a long story on a subject that I have been taking apart for several years, and David Emery up north has been studying the Battle of Arnheim, Arnhem. That was a battle that was lost because of the British and the Americans. This was the anniversary of this battle where a very bloody engagement took place and many lives were lost. And there is a lot of argument that they were lost unnecessarily, and the Germans came in and clobbered the Americans and the British and the Canadians that came in by parachute. And there were 17,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded at this battle, particularly Arnhem Bridge. At this particular battle, there were 6,000 or more at D-Day that were killed, and 17,000 killed in this particular area where they could have had a backup and didn't have a backup. And that is part of history that you have to find. It isn't in the headlines. We hear remembering D-Day where 6,000 or more died. 17,000 Allied died here. And there were 10,000 troops led into Arnheim, and 2,200 returned. This is the story of the SS Panzer divisions. Part of the troop that were working in that area were General Maxwell Taylor, who went on to be very important to the CIA and Southeast Asia and Defense Department policy, of course, and Prince Bernhard, the head of the Dutch regime, who belonged to Hitler's Gestapo but represented the resistance, in quotes, of the French, who really was a part of sabotaging, and of course later he goes on with the Vatican and the Knights of Malta and the various Nazis to form the Bilderbergers, which is a meeting every year to decide how they'll divide up the world since World War II. The importance of this particular scene was that they were stalling the war before the Battle of the Bulge. They were stalling the war, and also at the Bulge, to make sure that nobody got to Germany in December of 44. We could have gotten there, the Allies. We didn't get there into Berlin till May because the money from Germany and the gold had to be removed so that the Nazis could start over again. So at this particular place, the 17,000 Allied were killed. This is, as I say, this is the anniversary of that time. It took place in 1944. This is the 40th anniversary, and I'll take this in detail again and read anew and go back, refresh your memory on the material I've had on Arnheim, but the London Times has a full-page story on this anniversary, and people involved in that event are accusing the British, because it's a London newspaper, of stalling and not supplying them when they could have survived and lived. Now, along those lines, I read just this morning that Dr. Reidar Sognnaes passed away. This was in the LA Times and also on the wire services, or in the San Francisco Chronicle. Dr. Reidar, R-E-I-D-A-R, Sognnaes. He's a dentist, a forensic dentist. That has to do, of course, after people die, identifying them. He's the man who identified the remains of Adolf Hitler, and he also was the one in 1972 who was used with the dental records as irrefutable evidence to show that a skull unearthed in a West Berlin railroad station belonged to Martin Bormann, Hitler's chief aide. Mr. Sognnaes was the man who said, Hitler is dead and Bormann is dead. Now, many of these people, you get their biography, of course, when they die. That's why the obituaries are so interesting. A brief biography says that he lived in Norway and he went to Los Angeles in 1960 to found the School of Dentistry at the University of California at UCLA. Then he came there in 1960, where he had been at the Harvard Dental Medical School in Harvard Medicine for several years. 1960, Chancellor Murphy of UCLA was a member of the CIA. I assume he still is. He left UCLA in the late 60s and works for the Los Angeles Times. Went to work for the Chandlers, and when Times combined with the Dallas Herald Tribune, Mr. Murphy went on to that job. But at the time that this man started the School of Dentistry at the University of California in Los Angeles, he was brought in by the CIA by Chancellor Murphy. Now, interestingly enough, I had correspondence with the Chancellor of UCLA when he hired Wesley Liebler. Liebler was the attorney on the Warren Commission who was to cover up the interviews of the White Russian czarists, the Nazi czarists, the solidarists, brought in through the Central Intelligence Agency, through the Greek Orthodox Church and other channels. Liebler's role on the Warren Commission was with those people. Now, Liebler's law office, before he went to teach at UCLA in the law department, was with Mr. Frank Wiesner, who worked with the Hitler Nazis in Germany, and you can read about his book. There are many good books. John Loftus explains Frank Wiesner in his book on Germany and also trading with the enemy. No, Hein doesn't go into that, pardon me. It's Mr. Loftus who goes into the book, his book on Mr. Wiesner. The book, The Valera Secret, tells about Mr. Wiesner and the Office of Policy Coordination and his role, of course, with the OSS and the CIA. And then Wiesner allegedly, I guess he commits suicide. Maybe he was wanting to talk and was murdered, but he died. And Liebler came out to UCLA, and of course the School of Study of Violent Behavior and Nonviolent Behavior by Jolly West. Jolly West had been Jack Ruby's psychiatrist, one of them with the 1-minute epilepsy diagnosis. He came out to form that School for the Study of Violent Behavior in the psychiatric department from the CIA, Jolly West, and in the legal department, Mr. Liebler of the CIA, and in the dental department, the man who identified Adolf Hitler and Martin Bormann's teeth. Now, a subscriber to these tapes, a long friend, just sent me this past week an article, the Sunday London Times, December 31st, 1967, 7 years after Mr. Sognnaes goes to UCLA. It's the hiding place of Martin Bormann. And on the map, it shows where Bormann went to Chile, where he lived in corner of Brazil, way down low near the border of Uruguay. It's got Bormann's home. It's got detailed maps of where Mr. Mueller lived, who came with Martin Bormann. The article was written by a man, Eric Carl Wiedwald, W-I-E-D-W-A-L-D, an SS corporal in the last days of the war, who had been South America with Martin Bormann. This was 7 years after this fellow, as I say, was hired at UCLA. And in 1972, 5 years after the Sunday Times has all the details of Martin Bormann and where he's living with and who he's with and how he manages the money of Adolf Hitler, he says, I found the teeth of Martin Bormann. He's dead in 1972. Now, in the book by Paul Manning, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, he begins his book by saying, many of you have the book, Did the World Really Know Martin Bormann? And he claims that he knows as a fact that he is alive. He wrote this book several years ago. He traveled 4 continents. He met with people from all over the world. He tells how Martin Bormann set up his 750 corporations and put money and patents and bonds and blue chip stock in the United States. At this point, he can practically, and I assume he does, own the bulk of the United States stock market. This man knew of Bormann's flight capital. He tried to study it. He said it was unparalleled manipulation of public opinion and the media, and that's through people that are brought to UCLA from Harvard to the school to say in the media that Bormann is dead. And incidentally, arriving at UCLA in 1960, he came from Harvard, where he was there a few years with Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer and Mr. Elliott, Mr. Kissinger's long supporter and his mentor. They all have mentors that push them along. Now, in the book, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, he talks about the Gestapo money, the Odessa money, being managed in South America by General Gestapo Mueller, that's Heinrich Mueller. And the map published in 1967 shows you where Mueller is living. This entire book, of course, is about the money of Martin Bormann and the Nazis after World War II. And then to support that even more, there's a new book out I just got last week. I haven't even hardly opened it. It's published by Granada Press in Europe, called Nazi Gold, the story of the greatest robbery and its aftermath. And the Book of Records, I've quoted many times, says that the largest bank robbery in the world was the fact when the war was over in 1945, there wasn't any money in the German banks. It had all been removed. Well, two authors have taken 9 years to study this problem, and they have written a book. It's, as I say, it just came out in London by Granada Press, and I'm sure that Tom Davis at Research will be able to obtain it for you. I hope so. He got me my copy. And they studied where this money went. In those days, the missing money was millions, almost billions, and now, of course, it's many, many billions. And they try to trace where the Nazi gold went, and I'll be doing more of this also. The Nazis evacuate the Reichsbank treasure. Now, the Reichsbank, of course, was Hermann Abst, who now works with the Auschwitz Pope and the Vatican Bank, and this is a wonderful history of trailing this money and how it could be used after World War II to set up the future Odessa, which is the World Nazi Organization. Along those lines, there's another book coming out. If you can handle all these new books, and they're very, very important. This new one is called The Year of Armageddon, Armageddon. You know what that is. The Year of Armageddon, and this is by Gordon Thomas and Max Morganwitz. The other is by a Mr. Sayer and Botting, Botting, Ian Sayers, Asayer is his name. The book I referred to, The Nazi Gold, I don't think I gave you the author's name, Douglas Botting, Botting. Not to be confused, but I believe coming out from the same publisher, boy, do they get some brownie points. This is a book on John Paul II and his work with the CIA. The People's World had one article last week. It says that the John Paul II had secret briefings with the CIA. He meets every Friday. That's the day the station chief delivers its weekly intelligence summary to the Pope. The author says the CIA links to the Vatican go back 40 years when William Donovan, one of the founders of the CIA, he was the head of the OSS and father of U.S. covert action, met with Pope Pius XII following the end of World War II. Now, if you read my article in the Rebel just last November, Mr. Donovan removed Mr. Morleon, who was the chief of intelligence from the Vatican. While the war was going on, the OSS was paying the Vatican intelligence chief, and then when the war was over, he went back to the Vatican. Donovan was knighted in the Knights of Malta. Then the CIA was formed. It goes back further than the end of World War II because during the war we were protecting the Vatican intelligence system. This book says from the day that Donovan bowed his head before the Pope, the CIA has remained ensconced without interruption as the prime intelligence advisor to the successive pontiffs. Now look how convenient, and they of course don't go into this, if this pontiff followed the line of Pope Paul VI and the Milan Mafia and was the I.G. Farben Pope, and he's admitted he worked for I.G. Farben during the war and he worked for Solvay at Auschwitz. What a succession. Again, the Auschwitz Pope here, but working with our CIA. The People's World says it is the CIA, this is a quote from the book also, it is the CIA that keeps him continually informed on the situation in Central America, gives him accurate evidence of the spread of liberation theology that he's trying to close down, reports the latest behavior of the left-wing clerics in Nicaragua. A left-wing priest was just killed in Chile that set off riots, and they tell him about El Salvador and other interests. Now, there was another article on this, the Evening Press from Dublin, Ireland. Book tells of Pope's regard for CIA. It's the same book they're talking about, but with a little more allegations than the ones I read that were printed out here in California. It says this book, The Year of the Armageddon, it is published by Granada Press. The same people that got out Nazi Gold have this new book. And these are some of the allegations I have to run down briefly with you. in this book, how President Reagan's ambassador, that's William Wilson, to the Holy See became involved in gathering tapes from the Pope's radio station with the help of the CIA because the radio was maybe too anti-American. 2, how the U.S. branch of the Knights of Malta is routinely used to convey sensitive information from the CIA to the Pope. That's William Buckley, James Buckley, William Casey, Alexander Haig, the top elite of, and Mr. J. Peter Grace, the head of the Knights of Malta, and his organization, his board of directors with the Knights of Malta. This is the Knights of Malta is used to convey to the Pope what is going on in this country. So it is a military branch and always has been, and this book is going into the use of the Knights that we've talked about for several years. It also talks about why the papacy supports the PLO. Now that leads up to what I want to get into, and unfortunately there's been such a long introduction on this, but I couldn't pass this other news up. The Armageddon, the plans for the use of Israel to fight the Russians and to wipe out Israel. The Jews have to be killed. When the Armageddon comes, the Jews have to be killed. And he supports the PLO, always has, the Auschwitz Post. I'll be interested to see their reasons. But he entertains, of course, Mr. Arafat and Mr. Gaddafi and more than that. Also in this book, how the papal diplomats helped save Arafat from his redoubt in the Lebanon, how they can rearm him and get him back when he looked disgraced. And 5, this is another allegation in the book, why the Vatican became involved in Grenada 6 months before the island was invaded by the U.S. That medical school was run by the Vatican. It's a CIA medical school. It is a Catholic medical school. They can send Catholic medical coroners to do autopsies where there is a homicide and make it look like an illness or a simulated heart attack. This is the most dangerous relationship of medicine, of religion, of Nazis, of CIA, of Reagan policy. I have done extensive work on Grenada, and just before Rebel folded, I was to do a 4-part story on that consecutively. I hope that I can get more writing done. I haven't written anything since my first part on Grenada, just the first of the year last year. Terribly important and mentioned in the new book in the relationship of the Vatican and the Pope. Well, I'm on the subject of the Vatican, the CIA, the Nazis, and medicine. I may as well announce on this broadcast, I was going to wait till next week, but I'll do it right now. A gentleman has been writing a book for several years, many years, Lenny Lapon. He's worked with mental health and mental problems for many, many years, actually. LENNY-LAPON. He has a book, 250 pages, self-published, called Psychiatric Genocide in Nazi Germany and in the United States. He has taken it from Nazi Germany to the United States, mass murderers in white coats. Now, Lenny can't get this book. Of course, it would be hard to get it published at Random House or one of those books. He can't get it published like that. I don't know if he wants to. So he's selling it at $7 a copy, and I'll put the address here on the sheet that accompanies this broadcast. And you can send for the book, and then as soon as he has a certain amount, it doesn't take too much, he will start distributing the book. I've corresponded with him. He's a close friend of John Judge. We all know his work. He's given us invaluable material through the year. I have sections of the book already. The psychiatrists were the ones who wanted the genocide, began to advance it. I won't go into that now. You can get his book, and I want to do more on this subject, of course, all the time, if time allows. Sent for the book on the genocide, mass murders in white coats, psychiatric genocide in Nazi Germany, United States, $7, and you order that now so we can get the book rolling. Now for the remainder of this broadcast, the few minutes on this side of the tape and the other half, and probably into next week, no matter what the news I say, I won't interrupt it. I want to talk about religion and the White House, the Armageddon, where it's going, and the seriousness of it. The religious issue has been diverted to whether or not we can have abortions and taken it away from the Falwell level, the devout Christian, the fundamentalist Christian level, to reduce it to the Catholic, which is important, the Catholic confrontation with Geraldine Ferraro and Representative Mondale, the Vice President Mondale, rather. I think of in Congress, but he was a vice president, wasn't he? Okay, now, in the last few weeks, I've been building up to the politics of pressure on the emigre groups in the United States, the work of the evangelicals on broadcast 667. I discussed Richard von Weizsäcker, W-E-I-Z-S-A-C-K-E-R, the new federal president of West Germany, and his role in trying to combine East and West Germany, the anger of the Soviet Union that really brought a harsh confrontation in the meetings that are taking place today. Now, I believe that. Weizsäcker, as I said before, is active in the German Evangelical Church Assembly, and his father was the envoy to the Vatican for Adolf Hitler. So you have, I'm sure they wouldn't send an evangelical Presbyterian to the Vatican. I'm sure that the Vatican and evangelical and later the CIA, like the OSS and the Nazis, had a close link that they would combine their efforts to join in getting rid of the Antichrist, which would be Russia. And when Reinhard Gehlen resigned from BND, if he ever really did, he went to the evangelical church, and at that point the money mushroomed to the evangelical church and went into millions of dollars into TV, radio, small-time churches, and so forth. Now, I've so far done several broadcasts on the appointments of Ronald Reagan, and they are as important as the church, although I'm stopping them now, and I'll pick up maybe 5 more appointments next week because I have to. The appointments that Ronald Reagan is making and that I'm talking about link to the religious right. They link to Jerry Falwell and Mrs. Schlafly's Eagle Forum group, to Paul Laxalt and the letter he wrote to the various church members and the appointment of his brother by Ronald Reagan and his forwardness to the various pastors at this time. The fundamentalist pastors are General Wiedemeyer and the Fourth Reich and John Singlaub, going back to 007, the Korean airline, the Los Angeles Police Department, the Nazis in Central America. All of the contacts of Ronald Reagan and Gerald Falwell and the information that I have been giving you on through the past year and a half, and the appointments he's making for the future, all have common links to this fundamentalist Christian business, which at first hand seems so bizarre you want to laugh to talk about it, and then all of a sudden you realize that it's very, very real. Now, when Ronald Reagan went to Dallas, Texas, he had Jerry Falwell and a group of the far-right Christians at his side, delivering the opening speech at the Republican convention and also the prayer breakfast. But before he went to Dallas, he had a meeting in the White House of 300 fundamentalist Christian church leaders. They were the political forces of Christian fundamentalism. This is the New York Times, September the 10th, 1984. The White House met with these people before they went off to Dallas. This was mid-July, where these Christians met. These are the television evangelists who were to take the message to support Ronald Reagan on the airwaves. And this New York Times story tells about their contact with millions of people. These 300 major Christian broadcasters have an audience of 45 million listeners. Pat Robertson alone of the 700 Club has 24 million listeners, and Jerry Falwell spends $20 million a year on his television program alone, and then the others can broadcast out to there. And Ronald Reagan met with them, and according to this story, on July 9th they met, and the purpose Jerry Falwell set up was to get all of us ministers, for the first time, all of us ministers in contact with the White House and the leaders of the nation, to the president, to listen with our own ears, to hear from the president, from his own lips, his goals, his values, his total commitment the president would have to give. This is Falwell saying, we want to interview the president. We want to listen with our own ears to his commitment to the Christian fundamentalists, 300 of them. And This article describes a new umbrella organization set up by Falwell and the others, the New American Coalition for Traditional Values. They said it will replace the Religious Roundtable of 1980, when Reverend Dr. Bailey Smith said that God Almighty does not hear the prayer of a Jew. How in the world can you hear the prayer of a Jew who says that Jesus Christ is not the true Messiah? In 1980, they were blasting the Jew. They changed the title of their organization, but Falwell has been active in this continuously, and for psychological reasons, I guess they changed the name of the organization. We'll take a 1-second break and turn off over the tape and then continue with this subject. This is Mae Brussell. It's broadcast number 668. Tape number 668, September 28th, 1984. Before I get to Ronald Reagan and Jerry Falwell, who set this meeting up in the White House July the 9th, before the GOP went to Dallas, I just want to continue part of this article from the New York Times. It said, in large and small ways, moral majority drew charges of intolerance when Dean Wyckoff, W-Y-C-O-F-F, head of the moral majority in Santa Clara, said in 1980 that homosexuals, like murderers, should be executed. It would be the government that sits upon this land who would be executing the homosexuals. The government would be executing the homosexuals. The article goes on to say the difference between the organized force of what is called the New Christian Right in 1980 and now is that 4 years ago we had 3 or 4 preachers capable of articulating and debating the issue. Today we would have dozens, and there were 300 at the White House. The important additions are such men as Charles Stanley of Atlanta, Georgia, president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and host of a television ministry called In Touch, and television evangelist Jimmy Swaggart of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, James Robison, R-O-B-I-S-O-N, who gave the opening speech in Dallas for Ronald Reagan, from Fort Worth, Texas, and James Bakker, B-A-K-K-E-R, Praise the Lord Club in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, Mr. Jimmy Swaggart got on television 2 weeks ago, and he talked about the coming Holocaust for the Jews, and he said, the Jews will roast in hell. And I have a friend who listens to him every week who happens to be Jewish, and it scared the hell out of him because he takes what I say, takes it half seriously and doesn't, and for whatever reason listens to Swaggart, and then called me and was upset because Swaggart said that this particular friend would probably be roasting in hell. The New York Times said these men were part of a group, Swaggart and all of them, that met in Washington under the auspices of the American Coalition organization that Falwell set up of 300 of the major religious broadcasters and key denominational leaders. Before the meeting, Mr. Swaggart, in a crusade in Mobile, Alabama, taped his broadcast and said, next week, I will meet with ministers of the gospel. We will meet with the president and several of advisors to find a way to stem the tide of evil concerning problems that are taking place in this nation. He will advise the president. Mr. Reagan addressed the group. Mr. Falwell and the ministers had Mr. Vice President Bush attend, as well as Edwin Meese III and William P. Clark, of course, who brought Helene von Damme from Europe right to the von Bolschwing organization up in Sacramento. And these people talked with the president, told him what they want, prayed that he understood what they want, and the article concluded the size of the preacher's audience is difficult to determine. But Mr. Falwell has a computerized check of the various broadcasts and church minister list of donors and correspondence, and when you put all this together and compare the names and address, the bottom line is 45 million Americans are represented. And as far as the ministers are involved, they are active in representing 30 million voting age adults, and they're out getting more to vote. The head of the 700 Club, incidentally, did not attend this particular meeting. he didn't, at least he physically wasn't there, but what he has on the air is consistent with what they are doing. And again, Mr. Falwell said his airtime is about 20 million a year. And if you multiply those Christian pastors just on Sunday, once a week, not only their newsletters and their interviews, but going to the White House and the Defense Department and making policy, start multiplying what this is and see why the President of the United States is going with a far-right fundamentalist Christian. But again, I think the reason goes back to the Christian college in Illinois and the training, the education that Ronald Reagan got, that scholarship there, and the way he went through school. Now, I've had a long time getting into this subject that I want to talk about now. This information I'm sharing with you on the air as way of introduction, and then with a follow-up of articles since July, since the GOP convention on this subject, and the concern of many and the intent of many. I'm going into material that was sent to me by one of my favorite researchers who wants to remain anonymous, unknown in terms of identification, who's done tremendous work on the conflict of church and state. And this was presented, it's not prevented from anything, it was presented in Great Britain. It was written in a paper, and I have outlined it, as I always do when something is very important, to give you the primary points, and of course every sentence is important, but to follow it in sequence. So what I'm sharing with you may sound a little bit outrageous. We're going to go into certain words here that we've heard with the very, very fundamentalist Christians. If you turn them on long enough, the period of tribulation and the millennium that's coming and the tribulation of rapture, we're going into the biblical prophecies, the biblical beliefs of Jerry Falwell and the people that attended that White House conference, who have worked closely not only with Ronald Reagan, but with the National Security Council, the Pentagon, that worked with them continuously, and then the links of those people, as I say, to the police departments and the Nazis of World War II. This article, it is an article that could be published, has not been published, so you're hearing it for the first time on this broadcast, on these tapes, and that's why I don't want to interrupt it. So next week we'll continue. I don't want to rush through it. I'll give it as much time as I have because it's very basic. The allegation, of course, in the beginning, the statement is that Ronald Reagan is placing nuclear missiles in Europe, has placed them there, which we know the warheads are placed there. And they're placed there at a time when he's escalating his politics, his right-wing talk with his Christian fundamentalism. Now, that doesn't take away his dinner with Andre or his 23-second handshake. The Christian right has been working as the Knights of Malta to preserve the Roman Empire, the Christian fundamentalists fighting Russia, the Antichrist, for the past years, since 1917. So a few meetings and dinners don't matter. If Reagan gets too friendly, he can be shot like the other presidents or Mahatma Gandhi, the people he quotes, John Kennedy and Mahatma Gandhi, because these people are organized, they're funded, and I'm sure that their money goes back to the 50s and 60s when Martin Bormann and Reinhard Gehlen began disseminating the money through those Christian organizations, taking it away from the spy group, but try to separate the Vatican, the spies, the CIA, the Vatican, the Nazis again. So at a time when we are escalating our placement of nuclear weapons all around the world, circling, even we're going to place them in Japan, from the back of Russia, and certainly probably up in Alaska and the submarines, and the warheads are in Europe. At the time that the nuclear weapons are being placed in Europe, and this will soon be around the world, and when Ronald Reagan is using the fundamentalist Christians for his campaign to launch his 1984 presidential campaign, he is closely tied to the Christian fundamentalists with a lot of fervor, a lot of money, and a lot of support. And as I say, they're watching him, and we better start watching them. Now, Jerry Falwell, according to this paper, this is on Jerry Falwell, and the Christian right and Ronald Reagan and the war machine. Jerry Falwell is the center of the alliance between Ronald Reagan, the locating of the nuclear weapons and the missiles, and the fundamentalist church that believes that war is ordained. The Falwell Christians that went to that White House before Dallas Convention believe that war is ordained, it is imminent, it is a Bible prophecy. You've heard that before many, many times, but never before has the Christian right come so close to the White House and the Pentagon as they are moving every day or galloping. Christian fundamentalism, they believe that war is inevitable, that the master plan of the world, according to the Bible, nuclear war is, as I say, preordained. It has to happen. Now, these people have tremendous access to the media. I just cited one tiny article because it was apropos of the meeting July 7th with Reagan, of the funds and the amount of people. The Christian fundamentalists have satellite communication. They reach millions every single day, morning, noon, and night, not just Sunday, on the radio and TV. And they are setting up schools. I don't want to digress too far now, but Jerry Falwell just published last week, apropos of this, the list of schools that are being set up, Christian schools and ministers for this message. So if the message sounds silly later, and I hope I get to the message, I'm building up to it, the schools are being set. There are Christian kindergartens, preschool, the nursery school, the before kindergarten, the nursery school, up through the colleges, and then the priests that ordain. Now, Reagan uses this group for several ways. First, he uses them to put down the nuclear freeze. Now, all of this outline, as I say, is somebody else's work presented to me, and if I interpose some ideas, you'll recognize them if I go back-to-back broadcasts. But what I'm telling you is a continuous use of sentences and paragraphs done by somebody else. He uses it for the nuclear freeze. He uses the far-right Christian church to put down the freezeniks, make fun of them, and to say that they are really the people that would bring on the war. And he uses them to register votes for the 1984 election. That's why they went to see him. You know, we'll go for your Star Wars, your weapons, the making of the weapons, because war is inevitable, and we'll register the people to vote for you if you get this war going. It really tantamounts that, we'll get you in office because we don't like abortions, but war is in the Bible. Now, the center of all this is Jerry Falwell. He's the center of, as I say, the alliance between Reagan, and who is placing the weapons, the nuclear warheads, and the fundamentalist Christians who accept what is to happen. He's the closest to Reagan. In many ways, he's the one that brings those 300 people to him and sets up the prayer breakfast where he's the main speaker with his eyes closed, talking about this Christian nation. He keeps saying that this has to become a Christian nation. And Reagan has taped messages that Falwell shows on his TV programs. And as I say, he was the keynote speaker at the prayer breakfast so that Reagan could, when he spoke and Falwell spoke, they were hand in hand and visible together. Now, in 1980, Falwell helped write part of the GOP platform, the national platform, and also George Bush has spoken at Falwell's college, as have a lot of other people. He's been down there speaking. Now, according to these allegations, Falwell's close to the National Security Council. In March of 1983, Falwell was given a special National Security Council briefing at the White House on the nuclear freeze movement. March of 83 is when poor Maurice Bishop went to see Mr. Clark at the National Security Council, the same person, to try to cooperate with Grenada, and we were already getting ready to invade the island for a few years. Just to show you the time sequence, when one wants peace down there and we're ready to grab it, Falwell is also advised by the National Security Council on the nuclear freeze. The fundamentalist Christian who wants war, who says the Bible says it's inevitable, is advised by the highest level people paid by the taxpayers to bring in Falwell. At a briefing, Falwell was used to distribute a report he got called Special Briefing opposing an immediate nuclear freeze, to oppose those people that want the freeze. And again, Ronald Reagan refers to them as jackasses. And he uses his multi-million-dollar media, the TV, the radio, his newspaper, to influence these people against the freeze. He's given a briefing by the National Security Council on why you can't stop making atomic weapons, as if it is a Christian approval of nuclear arms. He's brought in to give it, if there's the kosher seal of approval on certain food, he gives it the Christian seal of approval that you can have these weapons. And non-Christians who oppose this are considered, of course, the Antichrist. If you are not a Christian, a fundamentalist Christian, and you oppose the nuclear freeze placement, you are put down, and of course that's what they do. Or even if you're a Christian who opposes the nuclear freeze, you're put as a misdirected Christian, and so forth. So while the nuclear weapon escalation is going on, Ronald Reagan has called Falwell into the National Security Council briefings. He's been allowed to be there. Falwell is also linked to the Pentagon. He has direct links to the Pentagon, and he is placed as the co-chairman of a group called Coalition for Peace Through Strength. And many of those names in this group that Jerry Falwell is co-chairman of, I've mentioned before, this is the leading lobby for massive increase in American military arms. On there is General John Singlaub, now again chairman of the World Anti-Communist League, with his long list of Nazis. And we'll go back into that, and on the board of Helionetics and the Space Wars, of course, the Star Wars. Admiral Thomas Moore, from close to Kissinger, Fritz Kramer, the Admiral Moore, the Joint Chief of Staff, Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is on Western Goals with the computers into LAPD with Larry McDonald. General Lemnitzer, Lemnitzer, former chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, ex-head of NATO. Major General George Keegan, Keegan, former Chief of Intelligence, the U.S. Air Force. I'm going over the Coalition for Peace Through Strength later. Helen Marie Taylor from Western Goals, and also the new appointment of Ronald Reagan's for the Humanities, is on the Coalition for Peace Through Strength with Falwell as co-chairman, and her cousin General Albert Wiedemeyer, who I did broadcasts about, who worked with Adolf Hitler until the time he invaded Poland, American general with Adolf Hitler, is on this group. So Jerry Falwell is co-chairman of Coalition for Peace Through Strength with people like Paul Laxalt, who's giving speeches and sending letters to the ministers for supporting Ronald Reagan in this Christian nation, the closest friend to Ronald Reagan, the man appointed by the user organization to become a future President of the United States, the GOP fundraiser at the current time, Senator Paul Laxalt. The who's who of Coalition of Peace Through Strength, as I say, run through my story on Larry McDonald, the Corrin Airline, the Western Goals, the police department computers throughout the world, and of course those computers have the list of the Antichrist who would be done with and set away during the pre-tribulation rapture. Now I just have a little bit of time to go into the philosophy, luckily, on what this is. Jerry Falwell believes in the Armageddon. That new book out on the Pope mentions is about the Armageddon in the title. That is that the war will happen. And Falwell is two different people. He believes in the Armageddon, that the war is God's plan. He has another book, according to this paper that was written up, many of you know, called Listen America, which is about conservative documents and beliefs on abortion and homosexuality and prostitution. That's the mild part of Jerry Falwell. The important part about Ronald Reagan and Gerald Falwell and the military people, the Coalition for Peace Through Strength, is their religious philosophy. And according to this paper that I am quoting, behind Falwell, pardon me, my voice is a little husky. I hope I'm not getting a cold now. Could be. I was down in L.A. where it was over 100, and then the temperature drops up here in Carmel to almost 40 degrees in just a few days or 48 hours. There's a contrast here, so maybe that's why my throat is a little husky. Now getting back to this subject of Falwell. Falwell has one side that is socially acceptable and mild, and you can argue about it. But behind Falwell, according to this paper, he is consumed by a demonic view of the world. He believes that Christians have nothing to fear in a nuclear war. In 1983, he made a tape on nuclear war. It was sent to people who are afraid of nuclear war. And part of the tape says this, that it's great to be a Christian. You don't have to worry. You don't have to march. The peaceniks and the freesniks are suicidal. The people that are doing this are committing their suicide. The Marxists and Leninists who are out to conquer the world are suicidal. Now, what he believes, what the fundamentalists believe, and this is different from what you and I think, and we may have laughed at in the past, but it isn't laughable when it moves to the White House, is what is called rapture. Falwell believes, and so do these 300 in the White House, that have millions and millions of dollars and hours. They believe that if you are a Christian, God will prevent the true Christians from dying in the war. That the end time is near, that famines and plagues and wars are signals of what is happening. Like Ronald Reagan said at the United Nations, we have our famines and plagues, but we can't think of the bad things because the best is yet to come. Look to the future. That is what they believe. And he cited the famines and plagues on the air and in the UN. Falwell says we are approaching a 7-year tribulation period. This is what they believe. That the fundamentals in the rapture. There's a 7-year tribulation period, and there's a pre-tribulation. Tribulation will conclude. There'll be 7 years of tribulation, and it will conclude with the final battle of the Armageddon that will appear with the second coming of Christ. Falwell believes in the pre-tribulation rapture. Some of the fundamentalists disagree on when these events happen. He believes in pre-tribulation rapture, that just before the tribulation, now remember there's a 7-year tribulation, 7 years. Before the tribulation begins, the true Christians around the world vanish from the face of the earth, that God will remove them and take them to heaven, and their Christian bumper stickers, if the driver disappears, grab the wheel, and so forth. Some of them have these very funny signs. The Lord will come. He will empty the graves of the saints. This is what Falwell and these fundamentalists believe. The Lord comes. He will take away the graves of the saints. Then the alive people would follow. They don't die, but they'd be separated, and they would be forever with him. And that is the rapture of the church, that they'll be with him. And the non-Christians, or the non-believers, will die and be separated. The unsaved are left behind, and they will endure 7 years of horrible tribulation. And this is called Jacob's trouble, when the Lord purges the earth of the non-believers, and the earth will be prepared for the establishment of our Lord's kingdom on earth. 7 years of tribulation, of separating the wheat from the chaff, the Christian from the non-Christian, the believer, and so forth. But if you are saved, you will never go through 1 hour or a moment of the tribulation if you are saved. And then the millennium, which is the 1,000-year, which is compared in the writing to the 1,000-year Reich, the millennium follows the tribulation. So you have this 7-year tribulation period, and the pre-tribulation rapture. The rapture comes first. That comes first. Then the pre-tribulation that he believes in. Then the tribulation, the Armageddon, and then the millennium follows the happiness. Now, one of the things I wonder, in applying, say, General Fritz Kramer has offices with Lieutenant General Daniel Graham in Washington. Graham is the man behind the space war frontiers. Robert Morris of the Knights of Malta works in Princeton with Gerard O'Neill and the space stations. I am wondering if the space colonies described in Alternative 3, instead of being used for the impoverished on Earth as the Earth gets polluted and so forth, could be used for the elite who are removed from the Earth while the Star War beams burn the non-believers. Will the non-believers be kept down on the Earth and polluted? When you see the drawings of the space colonies, it just looks too good for the ghetto people whose Bronx and various areas have never been built up since the riots in the United States. If you look in the impoverished areas of the United States, there is no money to build them up or to help the poor with their low-cost housing or health care. I'm wondering if the separation of the wheat from the chaff or putting the cream will use the space station or space colonies for a few while the others are burned out. Then they will descend again down to earth, be able to descend where the non-Christians are wiped out and burned to death. This is part of it. Then the millennium is 1,000 years of utopia. And that's where all that Martin Bormann money would come in. Whichever way it's separated, will one be sent to the space for genocide, like the Auschwitz, Swagger, and these people are promising you non-believers that you will roast in hell and burn if you don't get your cross on. Now this is important, and as I say, I'm going slowly, and if it takes the whole hour next week, we'll resume and continue with this, because if you reread your newspapers since July, forget going back 10 years ago, but I'll pull out some of you for 10 years ago, they are moving in, taking the votes, taking the bucks now. This is more than abortion. This is whether you're going to burn in hell or whether you're going to live. Now, Jerry Falwell, who works, like I say, with Paul Laxalt and George Keegan and Admiral Moore, William Simon is also on the Coalition for Peace Through Strength. I'll give you all the names later, in General Talbot, John Singlab. I mean, the who's who that we've had on the air for so many years, and Robert Dorman and also Jeremiah Denton. I'll give you the name of every single one of those and print them on the sheet, as I did with Western Goals. And you can look up their backgrounds or the tapes that I've had on them. But Jerry Falwell works with Knights of Malta, such as William Simon, and the Knights of Malta from the National Security Council, and the Fundamentalist Christian, and the military and the generals, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He believes that a major nuclear war is not likely, and he works with the Pentagon, but he allows a limited nuclear war. And March 4th, 1981, Falwell had an interview in the LA Times with Robert Scheer, where he described the limited nuclear war during the mid-tribulation with the Soviet Union, that the United States will not wipe out all of Russia. Russia will not die. Russia has many fine Christians, and he said the underground of the church in Russia and Red China is at work now. Russian and Chinese Christians will be taken out in the rapture period. They will be separated. Now this goes along with the Mormon church that is keeping the family names and background going back to the year 600, the Christian from the non-Christian. And he said in his interview in the LA Times, only the atheists would get roasted if you call Auschwitz and Dachau, prisons, roasting them, putting them in the oven. Nuclear war is winnable, and it is theological. Now, I don't have time this week to go into it. I'll just begin it. But the next session I'm going into is the same essay, or it was given as a speech in London, and written up is the role of the Soviet Union and Israel and Falwell. Why Falwell is close to Israel and the military, because they're going to use Israel to fight the Soviet Union, in essence, and then wipe out Israel. All the Jews in Israel have to be wiped out. And yet you see the organizations, a church, the Stephen Wise Temple, had Jerry Falwell as a speaker there. I take the B'nai B'rith Messenger, and I cut out the articles where Jean Kirkpatrick and Armand de Borschgrave and Alexander Haig and all the people working with the Vatican and with the Christian right are entertained and latch on to Jews and go to congregations and speak and are drawing the congregations. Now back to this. Now to continue with this same paper that was written on the role of the Soviet Union and Israel, which is part of the Ronald Reagan, Jerry Falwell, and all those 300 or more ministers' philosophy, and those were Christian fundamentalists. This isn't the Auschwitz Vatican Pope, and goodness knows how many of his cardinals and archbishops in the United States. This speech, it was given in London, says that both the USSR, not the United States, both the USSR and Israel have a special role, according to the fundamentalists, in terms of the tribulation period. The USSR needs oil. This is what Jerry Falwell says. And they will go to Israel. Israel doesn't have oil, so I don't know why he's talking about that. But the USSR will be destroyed by Israel. They want to go into Israel, which has nothing to do with their oil, but Israel's being goaded to arm and fight the Soviet Union as Israel is arming South Africa, the Bormann in Argentina, the military dictatorship in Chile, Pinochet, and the Somoza gang trying to fight the government in power in Nicaragua. Now, Israel has been given the money by the United States to arm the Nazi military dictatorships. They couldn't do it without the money of Jews who are either blind or part of this dirty game, and they are being goaded to fight the war against the Soviet Union. And then after Israel has victory over Russia, that will be the end of the mid-tribulation period. There's that 7-year period, the mid-tribulation period. And when the new Antichrist rises up, there'll be a 10-nation conference of Antichrist in this period, and more of a recreation similar to the Roman Empire. And the fundamentalists say, don't worry about that. The Antichrists are in preparation for end time, that they are soon to be all killed. That will be the end of the Antichrist. They may rise up, but they won't last. That will be the end of them. Now, this tape is over. I do want to continue with this next week and leave everything else so that you have a continuity. There was a long introduction this week, but all of that was important. This is Mae Brussell. I'll get back with you on this fundamentalist Christian problem next week and continue with what Falwell thinks, what Ronald Reagan thinks, and why the money and bucks are being used on television and printed material now, not only to get the votes, to prove they can get the votes, but to put the policies into action. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week.